Welcome to Legends of the Imperium. Here we explore the grim darkness of the Warhammer 40,000 universe, a place where there is only war. We uncover the forgotten stories of heroes and heretics, the rise and fall of space marines, the horrors of the warp, and the mysteries buried deep within the Imperium of man. Every legend we tell echoes through 10,000 years of blood, faith, and fire. So prepare yourself, citizen of the Imperium, for these are not just stories. These are the legends of the Imperium.
The city of Vrax Magna was a miracle of defiance, a structure that should never have stood, yet somehow clawed its way through millennia of corrosion and war. The hive rose from the ashen plains of its dead world, a titan of iron and faith, stabbing into the grey clouds that never parted. From orbit, its towers looked like a forest of knives, their tips vanishing into storms heavy with ash and industrial smoke. Down below, the soil was a poisonous crust. Nothing grew, nothing crawled, nothing lived without augmentation. But high above, in the upper spires where sunlight still broke through the haze, the air was perfumed, clean, and golden with artificial warmth. It was there, far above the choking billions, that Lord Magistrate Erast's Vihal made his home. He was not merely rich, he was sanctified by wealth, his bloodline traced back to the early days of the Imperium, when men claimed to have walked beside saints and generals of the Great Crusade. The Vihal crest, a silver aquila clutching a burning crown, adorned every surface of his domain. His mansion was less a residence and more a shrine to excess. Its foundations were built on gold-laced adamantine. Its walls shimmered with inlaid gemstones that pulsed faintly as serverlights danced across them. Every hall sang with faint hymns emitted from vox altars hidden within the architecture, ensuring that even silence was devout. He stood at the edge of his private balcony that morning, hands clasped behind his back, gazing across the endless sprawl of Vrax Magna. The sky was a marbled swirl of pale yellow and storm grey, the clouds stitched with distant lightning. Far below, the hive's middle decks were hidden by a thick layer of smoke, its factories bleeding fire into the air. From this height, it looked almost beautiful, the smoke rolling like mist across a sleeping sea. Erast smiled faintly, imagining it as incense rising to the Emperor, offerings from the faithful billions to the God-King who watched from his golden throne on Terra. Behind him, the soft flutter of mechanical wings echoed through the chamber. Servo-cherubs, their baby faces sculpted from pale porcelain and their bodies grafted with tiny jet engines, hovered near him. One carried a tray of freshly poured amazek. Another projected a faint hologram of the morning's prayer schedule. He took the glass from the first cherub without looking, savoring the scent. The liquid shimmered, faintly blue, vintage amazek from Belisarius Secundus, aged in the catacombs of a Mechanicus shrine. A bottle of it could buy a manufactorum floor. He drank slowly, staring into the fog beneath his tower. The door behind him hissed open, revealing a tall, gaunt man in a crimson robe trimmed with silver threads. The man bowed deeply, keeping his eyes lowered. "My lord," he said, voice carefully measured, "the ecclesiarch's envy awaits in the solar." Erast's turned slightly, his reflection warping in the glass wall beside him. "Already, they keep earlier hours than I remember." "The Ascension Festival approaches," the servant said. "They are eager to ensure your family's generous contributions are reaffirmed." "Of course they are," Erast's murmured. He placed the glass back onto the cherub's tray. "Tell him I shall join him shortly, and have the auto-confessors prepared. I would not wish to appear impious when I sit before the Emperor's chosen." The The servant bowed again and withdrew, leaving Erastes alone with the distant hum of machinery. He remained by the window for several minutes, watching lightning flicker beneath the clouds. To the people far below, the lightning would look like divine fire, a sign of the emperor's wrath or mercy, depending on which sermon they had heard that week. To him, it was merely weather. He turned and walked through his chamber, boots silent on marble floors. Statues of saints lined the walls, each one carved in living crystal, their faces serene, their eyes made of gold. Beneath their feet lay servitors, immobile and fused into the floor, their mechanical spines connected to the building systems. They whispered litanies endlessly, their voices melding into a low, sacred drone. The entire palace was alive with sound and prayer, a continuous hum of devotion that made the place feel less like a home and more like the heart of some slumbering god. Erastes moved through corridors illuminated by chandeliers of burning plasma contained in crystal orbs. The air smelled of incense and oil, the sweet and the metallic perfectly balanced. Servitors glided silently, polishing the walls, maintaining the purity of the space. Every now and then, a living servant passed, a human, fragile bowed almost double. They wore plain grey tunics marked with the sigil of the Vihal household, their heads shaved to show obedience. They did not speak, not unless spoken to. Erastes barely noticed them. He entered the solar, a vast circular chamber surrounded by tall windows that offered a panoramic view of the upper spires. A throne of gilded brass dominated the room's center, flanked by twin aquilars carved into the floor. Waiting there stood the envoy of the ecclesiarchy, a man of considerable girth and grandeur. His robe was embroidered with burning suns, his skin pale as parchment, his fingers weighed down by rings bearing relics of saints. He turned as Erastes entered, spreading his arms wide. "Lord Vihal," he boomed, voice oozing sanctity, "may the Emperor's light ever illuminate your household." "And may his radiance blind my enemies," Erastes replied smoothly, offering a shallow bow. They exchanged practiced smiles, the kind that never touched the eyes. The envoy gestured toward a floating hololith that displayed the layout of the hive below. Whole sectors blinked red, indicating areas of instability or spiritual degradation. He tapped one of the glowing icons. "There have been incidents, my lord minor, of course. Some of the lower manufactoria workers have refused their daily prayer cycles. The local ministorum believes it may be the work of heretical agitators." Erastes studied the display with mild interest. "You mean they are tired, hungry, and deluded, the usual state of the underhive?" "Perhaps," the envoy conceded, lips curling into a faint smile. "But faith must be maintained. Fear keeps faith alive, does it not?" Erastes chuckled softly. "Fear has served the Imperium well for 10,000 years." They spoke for nearly an hour about donations, about pious appearances, about the upcoming feast. The envoy's words were thick with reverence and greed. Erastes listened, nodding at intervals, already calculating which gestures would be necessary to keep the church content for another year. When at last the man departed, Erastes exhaled slowly, feeling a faint exhaustion settle in his bones. Religion was necessary. It kept the workers obedient and the nobles exalted, but it was also tedious. He preferred simpler things: silence, power, and the view from his balcony. As the door closed behind the envoy, Erastes turned to the window once more. The light had shifted, the clouds had parted slightly, revealing the faint glimmer of Vrax's dying sun. Its rays speared through the haze, painting the spire's upper towers in molten gold. The sight filled him with a kind of solemn pride. The Emperor's light, he thought, choosing to believe it literal. Far below, the manufactoria belts were invisible, hidden beneath the smog. He could not see the billions who toiled there. He could not hear their cries or the grind of machines. To him, they were an abstraction, a tide of flesh that kept the great machine of civilization turning. They existed so that the spire could shine. He moved to his private chapel, a smaller chamber attached to the solar. Inside, a single statue dominated the room, a towering image of the emperor himself, carved from pure white stone. Candles burned at its feet, casting trembling light across the sculpted armor and the serene, merciless face. Erastes knelt, not out of faith but out of ritual. He clasped his hands and whispered the morning prayer. The words came easily, well practiced, praises to the throne, vows of loyalty, pleas for protection against corruption. As he spoke, the walls around him hummed, vox systems repeating his words, magnifying them, feeding them into the hive's prayer network. Somewhere below, 1,000 other prayers were being transmitted simultaneously, merging into one endless litany that filled the planet's airwaves like static. When he finished, he rose and turned away from the statue. His eyes lingered on the golden aquila above the altar. "Keep them working," he murmured under his breath. "Keep them afraid." Outside, thunder rolled through the clouds. The wind howled across the towers, rattling banners that depicted saints with flaming swords. In a small service tunnel several floors below, a maintenance servitor twitched as a loose spark arced across its cranial implant. For a moment, the monotone hum of its prayer loop faltered. The single line it had repeated for decades, "The Emperor protects, the Emperor provides," stuttered into distortion. "The Emperor forgets." No one heard. The drone resumed its chant, its eyes flickering back to blue. Erastes returned to his balcony as the first chimes of noon sounded through the spire's vox system. The bells echoed down the tower, through every deck, every corridor, every hab block. To the nobles above, it was a song of order and divine stability. To the people below, it was the sound that marked another hour of survival, another moment granted by unseen masters. He breathed deeply, filling his lungs with the perfumed air. It smelled faintly of roses, harvested from biospheres orbiting near Terra. He thought of how fortunate he was, how far removed from the chaos and filth of the lower decks. He imagined himself as part of the Emperor's chosen, destined to maintain civilization's flame while the masses wallowed in ignorance. In truth, Erastes Vihal did not believe the Emperor was a god. He had long stopped believing in anything he could not see or command. But he understood the power of faith, how it could bind men tighter than chains, drive them to die for a cause they barely understood. The Emperor's divinity was the greatest lie ever told, and Erastes was one of its most devoted beneficiaries. He finished his drink and set the glass down. "Let the world burn below," he murmured, "so long as the spire stands." Beyond the clouds, lightning flared again, a jagged line of white fire splitting the heavens. For an instant, its reflection flashed across the mirrored walls of the palace, painting Erastes in stark light. He looked for that fleeting heartbeat, like one of the saints in his own halls, glorious, untouchable, and utterly inhuman. Then the light faded, leaving only the soft hum of machines and the distant, endless drone of prayer. The Feast of Light came once every solar cycle, marking the Emperor's ascension and the renewal of his eternal flame. Across the hive, it was both a holy day and a cruel spectacle. In the upper spires, nobles celebrated with feasts of gold and music. In the middle decks, the administratum held sermons of obedience. And in the underhive, the enforcers conducted the cleansing, a polite word for the yearly purge of those deemed unworthy of his light. Lord Erast's Vihal's palace was ablaze with radiance that evening. Plasma lamps hung like suns from the vaulted ceiling of his grand hall, flooding the marble floor with light that shimmered across thousands of gilded surfaces. Servants moved like clockwork, their grey robes brushing the floor, their heads bowed as they refilled crystal goblets and cleared half-eaten platters of rare delicacies, roasted grocs, silken squids from the void seas of Lethais, and fruits genetically sculpted to resemble golden roses. The air was heavy with incense, and the drone of distant hymns filled every corner. Hollow banners unfurled from the walls, each depicting the emperor as a blinding figure of fire and metal, one hand raised in benediction, the other crushing a legion of heretics underfoot. Erast sat at the head of the table, flanked by his wife, Lady Cyrene, and his eldest son, Lucian. Cyrene wore a gown woven from silver-threaded silk, her neck wrapped in a collar of tiny servolites that shimmered like stars. Lucian, young and proud, wore his father's crest emblazoned on his shoulder plate, though his eyes betrayed only boredom as the endless procession of guests and sycophants continued. "Another toast," cried one of the guests, a corpulent man whose rings clinked each time he raised his glass. "To the Emperor, eternal and unyielding." "To the Emperor," the hall thundered in reply. They drank. Erast smiled politely, feeling the heat of the amesak slide down his throat. The Emperor was on everyone's lips tonight, as he always was invoked, praised, adored, but never understood. The nobles' devotion was a currency, a performance of faith to prove their worthiness. At the far end of the hall, a choir of servo-cherubs sang in perfect harmony, their synthetic voices angelic and cold. Behind them, a dozen servitors lined the wall, their torsos fused into massive organ pipes that pumped incense and hymn simultaneously. It was perfection, symmetry, sanctity, control. And yet, somewhere below all that splendor, something faintly wrong crept into Erast's awareness. He noticed it first in the rhythm of the music, a minor dissonance, a slight falter in the cherub's pitch, so subtle it could have been imagination. But then came the sound of distant thunder, rolling far below the hive's visible layers. None of the guests noticed. To them, thunder was a background noise, as common as the hum of generators. But Erast's had lived long enough to know when thunder was not thunder. He glanced toward the massive windows. Where lightning flickered beneath the clouds, the light looked red. "Another glass, my lord," a servant murmured. Erast's waved him away, eyes still fixed on the horizon. The doors at the far end of the chamber opened, and the ecclesiarch's envoy entered once more, the same man who had visited that morning. His face was flushed, his robes slightly disheveled, as though he had hurried. Several of the nobles glanced at him, surprised by the interruption. "My lord," the envoy called out, his voice trembling slightly. "A word, if I may, in private." Erast's frowned. "No. It is urgent." He rose slowly, dabbing his mouth with a napkin. "Continue without me," he told the guests with a charming smile. "Enjoy his light. I will return shortly." The two men left the hall, the laughter of the nobles fading behind them. The envoy led him into one of the smaller side corridors, dimly lit by flickering lumen strips. Once the door sealed shut, the man turned, beads of sweat glistening on his forehead. "There's been unrest in the lower decks," he said quickly. "The Manufactoria priests report that an entire shift refused their prayer recitations. Some have attacked enforcers." Erastus's expression hardened. "And why bring this to me? That's a matter for the enforcer command, not my dinner table." "It is not ordinary dissent, my lord," the envoy whispered. They're saying the Emperor has turned his face from Vrax Magna, that the nobles have stolen his light." For a moment, silence filled the corridor. The words hung heavy in the recycled air. "Blasphemy," Erast said softly, though something in his chest tightened. "Yes, my lord, and if the workers believe it, others will too. The Ecclesiarchy requests that you reaffirm your faith, publicly, lavishly. A display of devotion will remind them of their place." Erast nodded slowly, though his mind was elsewhere. "The Emperor forgets." The phrase flickered in his memory, that strange distortion he had heard once before, whispered by a servitor or perhaps imagined. "I will arrange it," he said finally. "Tell your priests the feast will continue. If faith must be proven, we shall prove it with fire and light." The envoy bowed deeply and retreated. When Erastus returned to the grand hall, the celebration was at its height. Dancers spun in circles of golden cloth, their movements graceful and strange. Music thundered from the organ servitors. Lucian had climbed onto the table, laughing with drunken pride, holding a goblet high as he recited lines from the Imperial Creed. The nobles roared approval. But beneath it all, beneath the laughter and the wine and the music, Erastus felt the hive trembling, just slightly, like the heart of a beast stirring in its sleep. He raised his hand, and the music fell silent. Every eye turned toward him. "My friends," he began, his voice carrying across the room, strong and steady, "we dine tonight not in comfort, but in gratitude. For every meal upon this table, 1,000 hands labor. For every drop of amasic we sip, 1,000 throats go thirsty. And for every moment of our joy, 1,000 prayers rise from below. This is the balance of the Imperium, the divine order decreed by the Emperor himself." A murmur of approval rippled through the crowd. "But," he continued, "there are those who forget this order, those who whisper that the light of the Emperor can be stolen or dimmed. Let us remind them his light burns eternal, and tonight we shall feed it." He clapped once. The doors at the far end of the hall opened again. A procession entered, enforcers in black armor, dragging a line of prisoners. Men and women from the lower decks, their clothes ragged, their faces smeared with soot. Chains clanked as they were forced to their knees before the nobles. Some wept, others stared blankly, resigned. Gasps and murmurs spread through the hall. The guests leaned forward, fascinated. Erastus descended from his seat, his golden robe trailing behind him. He approached the prisoners slowly, his expression unreadable. "These," he said, gesturing toward them, "are those who have forgotten the light. They refused to pray. They spat upon the Emperor's name, but tonight they will be redeemed." He turned to one of the servants. "Light the pyres." At his command, the central dais shifted. Panels opened, revealing a circular pit filled with purified promethium. The smell filled the hall instantly, sharp, metallic, sacred. The prisoners began to panic, their muffled cries echoing off the gilded walls. Lady Cyrene turned away slightly, but Lucian watched, eyes bright. One by one, the enforcers dragged the prisoners to the edge of the pit. Erastes lifted his hands as the organ thundered again, the hymn swelling into a storm of sound. "By flame, may their sins be cleansed," he shouted. "By fire, may their souls rise to the throne." The first body fell into the fire. The flames leapt high, reflected in 1,000 jeweled surfaces. The nobles cheered. And in that blinding light, for just a heartbeat, Erastes thought he saw something move beyond the window, a faint shimmer, a shape watching from the storm outside. Something vast and winged, its eyes like dying stars. He blinked, and it was gone. The fire roared, the choir sang, and below, somewhere deep beneath the hive, the same words spread like infection through the tunnels and vents, whispered by the desperate, the dying, the forgotten. "The Emperor forgets. The light of the feast did not reach the depths." Far below the shining palaces and crystalline bridges of the Spire lay the underhive, a labyrinth of decay where the air was thick with soot and faith had rotted into desperation. The heat from the manufactorums above dripped down the rusted pipes like sweat, and the walls trembled with the endless thrum of machinery that had been working since before records began. Here there was no day or night, only the mechanical dawn of the plasma furnaces and the false twilight of cooling vents. The people who lived here, the forgotten millions, called it the Shade. Lyra was one of them. Before she became a servant in the Spire, she had lived her entire life in these tunnels. She remembered the sound of the filtration fans whining in the distance, the smell of burning chem fuel and rotting meat, and the whispers of the preachers who spoke of a god that lived in the sun but never came down. Now back in the underhive, she felt the old air fill her lungs again, heavy, sour, familiar. She had fled the feast that night. When the fire began to rise and the nobles sang hymns over burning flesh, she slipped through the servants' corridors, heart hammering in her chest. Her mind burned with the words she had overheard, the hypocrisy of those golden monsters who claimed to serve the emperor by devouring the weak. Now, 2 days later, she stood in the ruins of an abandoned hab block near the mid-level pipes, surrounded by the only people she trusted, a small band of laborers, preachers, and broken men who had long ceased to believe in salvation. "You came from the Spire?" asked an old man, his voice a low rasp. His name was Kale, once a forge overseer before the enforcers took his eyes for questioning a shipment count. Now he wore a strip of metal across his sockets, its surface carved with the imperial aquila. "I did," Lyra said softly. "I saw them burn the workers alive for prayer, for faith." Around her the others murmured. A woman spat onto the floor. A child began to cry. "They called it cleansing," Lyra continued. "They said it was the Emperor's will, but I heard them. They don't serve him, they serve themselves." Kale tilted his head slightly, the dull metal plate catching the faint light of a lumen coil. "Careful, girl, words like that bring the noose, or worse." "What worse is there?" she asked bitterly. "We are born in chains, we die in chains. They take our sons for labor and our daughters for the guard barracks. They steal our faith and call it obedience. I have seen the light above, and it's nothing but fire." The silence that followed was heavy. Then a voice rose from the back, thin, quivering, yet clear. She speaks truth. It belonged to Father Dreen, a withered man in a tattered robe, his hands tattooed with the symbols of the ecclesiarchy. Once he had been a preacher, until he dared to say that the Emperor's mercy extended even to the poor. For that sin, his tongue had been cut out and replaced with a vox implant that buzzed when he spoke. Now his mechanical voice echoed through the chamber. If the light above burns us, then we must build our own flame. Lyra turned to him, hope flickering in her chest. You would stand against them. He raised his hand slowly. Not against the Emperor, never, against those who speak in his name, yet serve only their hunger. Kale grunted. You'd call that heresy. I'd call it truth, Dreen said. The word seemed to fill the room, heavy and dangerous. For a moment, everyone was silent, as though afraid the walls themselves might hear. Then, one by one, heads began to nod. Lyra felt something stir in the air, something that had been buried under centuries of fear. A spark. We can't fight them, whispered a young man named Tor. They have weapons, soldiers, shields. We have nothing. You have faith, Lyra said. Not the kind they feed you, the real kind. The kind that doesn't bow to marble and gold. Kale's lips twisted in a grim smile. Faith doesn't stop bullets. No, she agreed, but it can start fires. Word spread faster than light in the shade. By the next day, dozens of workers were whispering Lyra's name. Some called her the Girl of the Flame, others the False Angel. She moved through the tunnels like a shadow, speaking softly, listening more. She told them not to curse the Emperor, only those who claimed to own his voice. She told them that faith was not a chain. Everywhere she went, she found the same thing: hunger, sickness, exhaustion, and quiet rage. Mothers burying children who died from exhaustion, men missing fingers from the machinery, priests too afraid to speak. By the end of the week, the first gathering took place. Hundreds assembled in an abandoned refinery hall, lit only by the glow of burning fuel barrels. The air was thick with smoke and the smell of rust. Father Dreen stood at the front, his vox voice echoing across the crowd. Brothers, sisters, you work until your blood turns to oil. You pray until your throats bleed. And what do they give you? Ashes, promises, lies. The crowd murmured, restless. He gestured toward Lyra. She has seen their feast. She has seen the truth. Let her speak. Lyra stepped forward, heart pounding. Hundreds of eyes were upon her, hollow, desperate, burning. I was like you, she began, born in the dark, raised to believe that the Emperor's light was too pure for us to see, but I have seen it now. I have seen the nobles drink our blood and call it devotion. I have seen them laugh while the faithful burn. A low growl rippled through the crowd. They say we are nothing, she continued, her voice rising. But I tell you this, we are everything. Without us, the manufactorums die. Without us, their ships starve. Without us, their gold is dust. We are the pulse of this world. A shout broke out from somewhere in the back. For the Emperor. For the Emperor, others echoed louder. Lyra raised her hands. Then let us remind them that the Emperor's gaze falls on all his children, not just those who live above the clouds. The cry that followed shook the hall. And so the whisper faith was born, not a rebellion, not yet, but something far more dangerous: belief. By the time word reached the upper levels, it was too late to contain. Enforcers stormed the lower decks, dragging priests from their shrines, executing workers in the streets. They called it purification. Lyra and her followers scattered, hiding in the ruins and ducts. Each purge only strengthened their conviction. In the weeks that followed, strange things began to happen. The lights in the mid-hive flickered with no cause. The servitor networks malfunctioned, repeating the same phrase over and over in distorted binary. The Emperor forgets. In the manufactorums, production lines ground to a halt as workers knelt in silence, refusing to labor until the flame returned. And in the spire above, Lord Erast's Vihal watched the reports pile up on his data slate, fury tightening his jaw. "Find the source," he ordered. "Find her." But how do you catch a whisper? Down in the darkness, Lyra watched the sky through a crack in the ceiling, a faint sliver of gold cutting through the smog. "She'll come for us," said Kale quietly beside her. "She already has," Lyra murmured, "but so has he." Her fingers brushed against a broken aquila pendant she had found in the rubble, once a noble's trinket, now tarnished and cracked. She smiled faintly. "Let them burn their fires," she whispered. "Ours is just beginning." The first sparks of rebellion didn't begin with gunfire. They began with silence. One morning in the Manufactorum district, the endless thunder of pistons simply stopped. The forges that had burned for 1,000 years went cold. Conveyor belts froze mid-turn, their servitors standing still like statues, mechanical eyes dimmed. Workers stood shoulder to shoulder, faces blackened by soot, hands trembling, not from fear, but from purpose. It started in Sector 12. By the time the enforcers arrived, it had spread to all 20 sectors below the mid-levels. Lyra stood atop a broken platform, a torn banner hanging from her hand, not a flag of rebellion, but a piece of stained cloth painted with a single crude symbol, the imperial aquila drawn upside down and burning. Around her, hundreds of workers gathered, chanting low prayers. Their words echoed through the tunnels. "The Emperor sees all. The Emperor weeps for the forgotten. Let his light burn through the lies." Father Dreen stood beside her, the flicker of his vox implant painting his gaunt face in ghostly light. Kale was there too, blind eyes turned toward the sky as if he could see the fire they were about to unleash. "They're coming," Kale murmured. "I know," Lyra said. "Let them." The enforcers came in formation, heavy boots pounding the metal decks, visors glowing crimson, their lasguns humming with lethal readiness. The leader, a massive man with a vox halo engraved into his armor, barked an order through the static. "By decree of the Spire Council, this gathering is illegal. You will disperse or be purged in the Emperor's name." Lyra raised her head. Her voice, calm and cold, carried over the hum of the guns. "In his name?" she asked. "You don't speak his name, you've forgotten it." The officer lifted his weapon. "Then let me remind you what his judgment feels like." The first shot tore through the silence. A worker fell, smoke rising from the hole in his chest. For a moment the crowd froze, and then the scream began. It was not fear. It was fury. Dozens of tools, rods, and hammers rose in defiance. The workers surged forward, their cries echoing off the metal walls, drowning out the enforcers' gunfire. Lyra was caught in the tide, shouting orders, her heart a storm of terror and conviction. For every worker that fell, two more took their place. They had no armor, no training, only faith and rage. But faith, when cornered, is more powerful than steel. Kale swung a wrench with the precision of a machine, crushing a soldier's visor. Dreen raised his arms and shouted a prayer, his vox crackling. The Emperor's mercy is not yours to give. The crowd roared with him. The enforcers faltered. Then came the explosion. A plasma vent ruptured above them, ignited by a thrown torch. A blue-white flare tore through the chamber, incinerating everything in its path. The shockwave hurled Lyra backward. The world spun in a blinding storm of light, smoke, and screaming metal. When her vision cleared, the enforcers were gone, buried beneath the twisted wreckage. Flames licked the walls, casting the chamber in shades of orange and blue. Bodies lay scattered like shadows of faith. Lyra rose to her knees, her body trembling. Kale's voice came through the smoke. "You did it. You set the fire." She looked at her hands, blood and ash mixing together. "No," she whispered, "we did." By nightfall, the entire underhive was burning. Every tunnel, every hab block, every forgotten shrine. The people who had once knelt in silence now rose in fury. They carried torches, scavenged weapons, and broken icons of the Emperor. Their chants echoed up through the spire like the rumble of a storm. The nobles above heard it and trembled. In the spire's high council chamber, Lord Erast's Vihal watched the flames spread across his holomap. "This is not a riot," he hissed. "It's contagion." The High Prefect, an ancient woman with a face stretched thin by rejuvenate treatments, whispered, "Then burn the wound before it festers." "And if it spreads to the mid-hive?" Vihal asked. "Then burn that too." Moments later, the order was given. Purge Protocol Ignis Sanctus. The Emperor's holy fire. The skis above the underhive turned crimson. From the Manufactorum towers, massive incinerator cannons descended, belching torrents of flame into the lower levels. The screams of thousands rose with the smoke. Entire sectors were reduced to ash in minutes. Lyra watched the inferno from the ruins of a Spire, her cloak wrapped around her face. The heat seared her skin, the air itself tasted of death. "They're killing everyone," whispered Tor, the young man beside her. "Men, women, children, they don't care." "They never did," Lyra said bitterly, "but they've made one mistake." "What mistake?" "They've shown us what they fear." Behind her, Father Dreen limped forward, his voice box flickering. "You can't fight fire with flesh." "No," Lyra said, "but you can choke it." The plan was madness. It had to be. The Manufactorum core, the heart of Vrax Magna's production, was powered by a plasma generator the size of a cathedral. It was the one thing the nobles could never destroy, for it powered the very shields that protected their spire. If the workers could reach it, they could shut it down. If they shut it down, the spire would fall. And so they moved through the ruins, through smoke and corpse piles, hunted by the enforcers and the machines of the Adeptus Mechanicus. Each step was a prayer, each breath a defiance. Kale led the way through a collapsed transit tunnel. Tor carried a salvaged lasgun, trembling but determined. Father Dreen whispered prayers for the dead as he walked, his words now half mechanical, half divine. When they reached the generator vault, they found it guarded, not by enforcers, but by servanites of the Mechanicus, towering constructs of brass and bone, their faces hidden behind holy masks. Unauthorized entry, one intoned, voice like a choir of static. Access forbidden, purification authorized. Kale raised his weapon, but Lyra stopped him. "No," she said, "let me." She stepped forward, her voice steady despite the fear tearing at her chest. "Servant of the Omnissiah," she said, "you serve the Emperor through the machine, do you not?" "Affirmative." "Then look upon what your masters have done. They burn his children in his name. Does that serve the machine god or the hunger of men?" The Servanite paused. For a heartbeat, nothing moved. Then its head tilted slightly, gears whirring. "Logic inconsistency detected," it said. And then slowly, it stepped aside. Lyra turned back to the others. "The Emperor's will is with us," she said softly. They entered the vault. The plasma core pulsed like a star imprisoned in metal. The light was blinding, beautiful, a sun beneath the earth. Dreen's mechanical voice trembled as he spoke. "If we cut the conduits, it will collapse the entire grid." "Then the nobles will fall with us," Lyra said. Kale laid his hand on the console. "Then let's send them down in gold and fire." They began to work, rerouting power lines, overloading converters, praying under their breath as alarms blared. The heat rose, the air vibrated, and the core began to hum louder, deeper, angrier. Outside, enforcer reinforcements stormed the tunnels. The battle that followed was chaos, flashes of light, screams, metal grinding against flesh. But still, the workers held the line. Every man and woman who died bought another second of resistance. Inside the vault, the core began to fracture. Blue-white veins of energy crawled across its surface. The machine roared like a god waking from slumber. Lyra stood before it, her face illuminated in its terrible glow. "Father," she whispered, "is this heresy?" Dreen looked at her, and for the first time, his broken vox glitched into something that almost sounded human. "No, child, this is truth." The core exploded. The shockwave tore through the underhive, consuming everything in light and fire. For a brief, blinding moment, Vrax Magna became a second sun. The spire above shattered. Its towers, symbols of centuries of greed and sanctimony, crumbled into the clouds. The gilded palaces of the rich burned like candles in the wind. The nobles screamed as their sky bridges fell, their luxury becoming their tombs. From orbit, the planet's night side was visible, a single, vast bloom of light devouring the hemisphere. And in the center of it, where the underhive once stood, a single voice echoed through the void, the last broadcast of Father Dreen's Vox implant carried through the dying signal. "The Emperor sees all. The Emperor remembers. The forgotten are forgotten no more." Then the world went dark. Hours later, In the silence that followed the storm, a single figure crawled from the ashes. Lyra. Her body was burned, her lungs filled with smoke, but she still breathed. She looked up at the ruins of the sky, where the spire had once pierced the heavens. Nothing remained but dust and the faint, broken light of a dead sun. She pressed her hand to her heart and whispered, voice hoarse but steady, "We were the fire, and the fire endures." The silence that followed the fire was almost holy. Vrax Magna was dead. The spire, once a glittering monument to imperial order, had collapsed into a grave of molten metal and ash. What remained of its upper towers lay scattered across the plains like the bones of titans. The smoke still rose, thick and black, coiling toward the void as if seeking absolution. But the Imperium does not forget, and it does not forgive. The arrival of the Inquisition. 2 weeks after the destruction, a black ship descended through the storm-racked skies. Its hull bore no markings, only the faint outline of an eye carved deep into the adamantium. The people who survived the purge, the broken, half-blind refugees crawling through the ash, fell silent as its engines screamed overhead. When it landed, the air rippled with ozone. The ship's ramp lowered, and the first figure stepped out. Inquisitor Tiber Septane. He was not like the nobles who had ruled the spire. There was no gold on him, no jewels or silks. His armor was matte black, inscribed with litanies of purgation. His face was pale and smooth, his eyes burning with the faint light of augmetics. At his side hung a bolt pistol marked with the sigil of the Ordo Hereticus. Behind him marched a detachment of Sisters of the Ebon Veil, their armor black and crimson, their faces hidden behind mirrored visors. They moved in silence, spreading through the ruins like carrion angels. Tiber knelt and picked up a handful of ash, letting it fall between his fingers. It was warm. "The Emperor's work," he murmured. Then, after a pause, or his test, he straightened and turned to his adjutant, a woman named Lycia, whose flesh was half replaced by augmetics. "Begin the survey. I want all data, all survivors, all Vox records. If there are any witnesses, bring them to me." The survivor. They found Lyra 2 days later, buried under a collapsed hab pillar, her body wrapped in scorched metal and prayer cloths. Her heartbeat was faint but present. When she awoke, she was in a containment cell aboard the Inquisitor's vessel. Her arms were bound in stasis cuffs. The light burned white and pure without shadow. The room smelled of incense and disinfectant. Tiber entered alone, his boots clicking against the steel floor. He studied her for a long moment before speaking. "You are fortunate," he said. "Most who dwell in rebellion are not granted breath after judgment." Lyra lifted her head. Her face was pale, her lips cracked, but her eyes still burned with that same defiance that had once lit the underhive aflame. "I am not fortunate," she said. "I am alive." The Inquisitor smiled faintly, a distinction without a difference. He circled her, hands clasped behind his back. "Tell me, child, why did you destroy this world?" Lyra met his gaze without fear. "I didn't destroy it, I freed it." "From what?" "From lies, from those who said the Emperor is a god who blesses only the rich." Tiber's expression didn't change. He stopped behind her, his voice soft but sharp as a scalpel. "And what makes you think he blesses you instead?" Lyra didn't answer. Instead, she closed her eyes and whispered, "He was never theirs to own." The Inquisitor watched her for a long time, then he turned to leave. "Perhaps," he said quietly, "or perhaps you are the proof that faith burns brighter in heresy." The Inquisitorial Report. 3 weeks later, Tiber stood on the bridge of his ship, dictating his final report to the Ordo Hereticus. Designation: Vrax Magna. Status: Exterminatus Class Purge, Unauthorized Ignition Event. Casualties: Estimated population loss, 7.4 billion. Primary cause: Civil insurrection originating in sub-Spire levels. Secondary cause: Plasma core destabilization, possible sabotage. Investigation findings: Evidence of cultic activity mixed with socio-political dissent. Possible infiltration by Xenos or warp influence, inconclusive. Survivors: 0.0004%, contained, classified. Inquisitorial judgment: The Emperors will manifests even through the misguided. Recommend designation as cleansed by divine flame. He paused, his eyes drifting toward the viewport, where the planet hung below, a scarred and broken sphere. Lycia approached quietly. "Do you believe she was telling the truth?" Tiber didn't answer immediately. His eyes flickered with the reflection of the dying world. "She believed what she said," he replied. "That's enough." "And her fate?" The Inquisitor looked down at the data slate. "Transfer her to Terra. The Ecclesiarch himself will decide her soul's worth." Lycia hesitated. "You think she'll be executed?" Tiber gave a thin smile. "Of course, but they'll make her a saint first." Lyra's fate. "They chained her in a stasis pod and sent her across the stars. The voyage took months. She dreamt in fragments of fire, of the chanting voices of the underhive, of Kale's laughter echoing through the smoke. Sometimes she saw the Emperor himself, standing before her, not as a god of gold and light, but as a weary man watching his creation burn. When she woke, she was in another world, the ecclesiarchal palace on Terra. The priests of the high faith gathered to judge her, robed in scarlet and white, their faces hidden behind veils of sanctity. The chamber was larger than any cathedral she'd ever seen, its ceiling lost in incense clouds. She was brought before them in chains of gold. The archconfessor spoke, his voice amplified by 1,000 cherubim. "You claim to have heard the Emperor's will. You claim your rebellion was divine." Lyra stood straight, her voice steady despite the weight of chains. "I do not claim it, I felt it. He does not live in your towers or your gilded halls. He lives in the dust and the hunger, in the hands that build and bleed." The priests murmured in outrage. The archconfessor raised his hand. "And what of those you murdered?" Lyra's eyes flicked up toward the vaults. "Every one of them was already dead. I just gave them the fire to rise." For a moment, silence filled the hall. Then the archconfessor smiled, slow, cold, understanding. "Then let the fire judge you." He gestured to the guards. They dragged her away, down through endless corridors, to the Basilica of Flames, where her execution awaited. The miracle of ash. They bound her to a stake of iron and wood. The pyre beneath her feet was drenched in sacred oils. Crowds filled the square outside the basilica. Nobles, priests, soldiers, and the faithful all gathered to watch the heretic burn. Cherubim hovered above, chanting litanies of cleansing. As the torches were brought forth, Lyra looked to the horizon, to the faint, dying light that bled across Terra's polluted skies. She closed her eyes. "The Emperor sees all," she whispered. "The Emperor remembers." The flames caught. For a moment, she screamed. Then something impossible happened. The fire turned white. The crowd gasped as the pyre blazed with unnatural brilliance, not consuming, but illuminating. Her body didn't blacken. Instead, it shone like a figure carved of gold, her eyes burning with pale fire. The guards fell back, priests shouted, the archconfessor froze. When the light faded, only ash remained, but in the ash, burned into the stone itself, was a symbol, the imperial aquila inverted and aflame. And from that day, whispers spread through the lower hives of Terra. They spoke of the Saint of Ash, who burned and did not die, of the fire that would one day rise again, of the Emperor's forgotten children waiting for their time. Epilogue: The Inquisitor's Dream. Years later, Inquisitor Tiber sat alone in his quarters aboard a different ship. He was older now, his flesh pale and stretched thin over augmetics. The fire of his faith still burned, but dimmer, colder. He dreamt often of Vrax Magna, of the screams, the fire, and the girl who defied him. Sometimes he dreamt that she was right. On this night, as his ship drifted through the warp, he awoke to find his cabin filled with ash. He rose, reaching for his pistol, but then he saw her. Lyra, standing in the corner, her body half light, half shadow. "You can't be real," he whispered. Her voice echoed, soft as prayer, terrible as truth. "The fire never dies, Inquisitor, it only waits." And when he blinked, she was gone. But in her place, burned into the wall, was that same symbol, the flaming aquila glowing faintly in the dark. The Imperium endures, but so does the fire beneath it.